I welcome you all for the second session on the process involved in counseling. As I mentioned in the beginning of the previous session, the process of counseling will be dealt in two sessions. And in the first session, to recap to you, we have discussed about the objectives that we have set for the presentation, and then we have discussed about a brief introduction, and then we have discussed on the first two process, that is the initial interview and the second the assessment which we carry out in the counseling has been discussed. And I have given a very clear cut stress on the process of the importance of the process of counseling, because if you know the process very clearly, if you could able to undertake the process in a very smooth and very clear manner, then we could able to address the issue that we have taken in a very effective and very efficient manner. So, we don't have to spend more time and more resources, and we can able to address the problem and we could able to achieve the set goal. So, the process is very crucial when we are doing any activity, and this becomes very important when we are undertaking the aspect of counseling also. The third phase, that is the middle phase, it occupies the maximum period of the counseling session. As I mentioned before, the middle phase where we employ all the techniques in terms of addressing the problem of the client, because during the initial phase and the assessment phase, we try to understand the client during the initial interview, and then we try to understand the problem which the client is facing during the assessment process. And during the assessment, we try to understand what is the primary problem which the client is undergoing, what are the accessory factors which really contributes for the client, and what are the factors which in some sense tries to hinder the overall progress of the client, and what are the factors which tries to provide the relief for the client. All those factors we are trying to understand during the assessment. Once we understand the problem of the client, we need to address that problem, and the middle phase comes in there exactly. In this phase, we employ actually the various techniques in terms of addressing those problems, the primary and the accessory problems, and the various factors which are hindering the client. We try to address it, and we employ various techniques on that, and this will be dealt in the forthcoming sessions, because for each and every problem we tend to employ different techniques and we use different strategies and approaches which cannot be dealt in this particular talk today. So, in this talk, as we discussed in the beginning, the initial phase, the assessment and the termination will be covered in detail, and we will be talking about the middle phase, but the detailed discussion on the middle phase and the various process and the techniques which we use will be dealt in the forthcoming sessions. In this phase, the counselor analyzes the client's feeling, the behaviors of the client, and provide a feedback to the client and provides the required support and guidance to effectively bring in the behavioral changes which the clients needs to bring in. And if they could able to successfully able to do all these things, and they could able to bring in the real change, and they can able to address the set goal and the objectives during in the initial process of the counseling session. To bring in the behavioral change, the following factors should be considered. The first and the foremost is what are the emotional factors that have to be corrected to resolve the dysfunctional behavior of the client. Many a times actually this dysfunctional behavior only creates problem, either it could be the interpersonal or it could be because of the intrapersonal relationship it can affect. And what are the faulty ways of thinking that the client manifests that the needs to be corrected. So, many a times the thought process of the client is having a problem. They used to think in a very wrong manner. They do not approach the problem in a right way. Since they are not approaching the problem and their thinking process is having an issue, they continue to face the problem and they cannot able to address the problem in a very effective manner. So, the faulty thinking process needs to be corrected. And the third aspect which is being majorly taken care during the middle phase is the social and the environmental factors, which I've already mentioned, how the client is related and associated with the social and the environmental factors, because the social and environmental factors plays a very important role, and I've discussed this particular aspect in detail with an example in the previous session. How the client, when they are having the interpersonal problem, it is with themselves, but when they are having the intrapersonal problem, majorly it is related with the social and the environment in which they live in. If you could able to successfully carry out the middle phase, and we could able to assume we will be gaining actually certain therapeutic gains we will be getting in the middle phase. The first and the foremost is the resolution that we get for the emotional crisis. Usually the client comes with the emotional crisis, and if we could able to address the problems related to the emotional aspect, then surely we will get some kind of a solution to that emotional crisis. And the second is the behavioral problems which the clients comes with, and we will try to get some kind of a solution with related to that behavioral problems. Since the emotional crisis and the behavioral problems are addressed, it really improves the self confidence as well as the self esteem of the client, and it improves the self control of the client, and it builds on some kind of a tolerance in the client when they are actually facing certain actually frustrations. It also improves the reality orientation and appraisal of threats. Many a times the client are not grounded. They will be having certain kind of aspirations which are not achievable. They will be very ambitious. They are not really grounded. So if we could able to do the therapeutic intervention process properly, then it really helps the client in terms of understanding the reality and what kind of aspirations the client can have, and what kind of aims and goals the client can aspire for in terms of achieving it. That reality orientation can be able to bring in, and improved communication and the problem solving skills of the client. As I mentioned in the beginning, that communication, whether it is actually the intrapersonal or when it comes to the intrapersonal, how we are communicating with the fellow, either in terms of the family members or in terms of the friends or in terms of the workplace colleagues. Okay, what kind of communication that we are having, how we are communicating, whether we are actually communicating with them properly with giving proper respect, and what kind of attitudes that we are showing with them. So those things can be improved when we are doing the therapeutic process properly, and improved overall adjustment, judgment and emotional stability. So many a times actually the client lacks on those aspects. They cannot judge a person. They don't know which person to believe in, which person to not to believe in. Okay, so the judgmental aspect can be improved, and similarly the emotional stability of the client, how to behave or how to emotionally see certain situation and how to handle those situations can be learned actually by the client. And coming to the last phase, that is the termination of counseling. It is one of the very crucial aspect when it comes to counseling, and many a time the client do not know how to actually end a counseling process. And when we are talking about this counseling, termination of counseling process, there are various stages actually which has to be undergone, starting with evaluate the readiness of the termination, prepare advance notice of termination, discuss the readiness for termination, review the course of therapy, emphasize on the client's role in effecting change, warn against fight into health, give instructions for maintenance of adaptive functions, discuss follow-up session and stress open doors. So these are some of the stages which the counselor has to undergo. So if they could able to successfully undergo all these stages, then it really prepares the client in terms of moving towards the termination process of the counseling session. And if he fail to follow these steps, then the whole termination process becomes abrupt, and the effort and whatever the initiatives that we have taken, that will not fully yield the expected result. So, we will try to go through one by one stage, and we will try to understand how the termination process has to be undertaken. To start with, evaluate the readiness for termination. Counseling is always conducted with some kind of an actually predetermined goals. So, when we start in the initial interview, I said usually we need to set a clear cut goal, and the goal has to be very specific. What is the actually thing that we wanted to achieve out of the whole counseling session? So, when we have this kind of a clear cut predetermined goal, so this will really help whether the client has achieved those predetermined goal. If the client has achieved those predetermined goal, then automatically the whole process of counseling moves towards the termination process. So, is the plan of therapy running its course? So, whether whatever the middle phase, that is the therapeutic process which they have undertaken, whether it is moving towards in terms of achieving those predetermined goal, whether they have achieved it already, how much they could able to achieve it, or as the client grasped the principles of therapy, how much the client understood their problem and the ways in which in terms of addressing those problems. So, if the client able to understand it, then they could able to sustain the whole actually therapeutic process. Are the goals of therapy in the process of being attained, whether they could able to achieve those actually goals? Will the client's moral stand up for the termination? Many a times what happens is that the client are not mentally prepared, or they are not ready to actually move towards the termination. So, whether they are morally prepared in terms of actually going for the termination. And finally, is the client able to maintain the functional equilibrium? Functional equilibrium is that the stage which the client wants in their life, okay, to function in a very smooth manner. So, if the client could be able to do their functions in a smooth manner, that is what we are trying to mention here as the functional equilibrium. Sometimes the termination might be due to the external influences such as the time constraint and unforeseen contingencies. So, if these kind of cases happens because of time constraint and the unforeseen contingencies, if the readiness plan is already been in place, in some way the client could be able to manage the situation, and then they could be able to get some kind of a sustained result. Otherwise, then this termination becomes abrupt and the whole process will get actually halted. Provide advance notice to the termination. It is another very important aspect. Many a times what happens is that the client may not be knowing which phase of counseling process they are in, how much they have achieved and where they are moving towards, how much goals which they have set they have been achieved. So, there is no reorientation or discussions related to the phase in which the clients are and the treatment process which they are undergoing. So, the client should be informed in advance. So, these are the goals that we have set for you, and this many goals we have already achieved, and we are going to actually move in terms of addressing these goals. So, once we achieve this goal, and we are going to terminate it. That initial orientation or in terms of providing the basic information to the client becomes very crucial. If they know where they stand, it becomes much easy for the client when they are moving towards the termination phase. So, the client can psychologically orient themselves towards the independent functioning. So, once they know that actually this is the problem that I had and this is the goal that I set for, and I could be able to achieve this much. So, once they know that, then they can become actually independent and raise issues that he had either to left undiscussed. Many a times what happens is that when the client, when we talk about termination, then only they will inform they are having some other problems also which they have not at all discussed, and that problem will be very much related to the goals that we have set and the issues that we are addressing. So, if you are not taking up that issue, the whole process becomes futile. So, again the advance notice of termination becomes important, so that the client, whatever the additional or the other related issues which they are facing, they will come up and then they will actually inform to the counselor. And clarifying doubts and misconceptions. Sometimes actually the client, though they are achieving the set goal, they will not be fully clear, or they will be having some kind of a misconceptions. So, once those doubts have been clarified, the client automatically their self esteem and confidence get increased, and they will be in some sense become or move towards in terms of the independent functioning and avoid crisis due to poor self confidence. So, whatever the crisis which they are facing, so if we could able to avoid it, automatically the self confidence of the clients can be improved. Discuss readiness for the termination. The clients, when we want to talk about the readiness for the termination, first we need to understand what is the appraisal of the client, where they think they are standing, how much they believe that actually the problems which they have came up with have been addressed. So, the client's appraisal of the situation becomes very essential before the termination, and understanding his or her confidence to handle the future situation on their own also is very crucial. If they have that kind of a confidence, then the termination process becomes actually much easier. The counselor sometimes have to bow down in terms of the client's judgment, because if they say that actually this problem as you presume is not fully addressed, I need or some more time in terms of actually addressing the problem fully. So, if the client says that, the counselor should take those into account. This does not mean that actually we are making the client dependent on us. On one side, the counselor should take note of actually the client's judgment. Parallelly, the counselor should see the client is not becoming fully dependent on him or her. And review the course of therapy is another important aspect. Assume that the therapy is succeeding in achieving the functional equilibrium. It is necessary to understand the dynamics of such equilibrium, because many a times when we are trying to become a person independent functioning, and if you fail to address what are the various dynamics which is happening around, and if you are not orienting the client, so these are the various factors associated with this actually particular problem, and you need to take into account. So, if the client is oriented towards that, then they can able to manage the situation in a much better and effective manner. It helps them to identify what are the various tools required or various aspects which are required in terms of maintaining that equilibrium, or in terms of addressing those dynamics which is happening around in terms of the equilibrium. So, this becomes very crucial, and the client should try to review what is the problem that they have come up with, and what kind of goals that has been set, and what kind of actually techniques which has been employed by the counselor in terms of actually bringing in changes in the client, and what kind of progress that they have made, and similarly what kind of setbacks that they had during the course of therapy. If the client could have an bird's eye view on this therapy process, then they could able to sustain the whole process, and they can able to revive where they at what actually stage they have come in and where they have moved towards, how much they could able to achieve, and emphasize on client's role in effecting change. So, this is another very crucial aspect. Many a times the client always try to glorify the counselor, whatever the gain that they had, whatever the results it has been achieved, they always say that it is because of the counselor I could able to actually make this much changes in my life. Because of the counselor, the problems which I am having has been addressed. Because of the counselor only, I am become what I am right now. I could able to actually have a fully independent life. They try to give all the credits to the counselor. However, the client should understand the role which they have played by themselves, and even the counselor also should try to emphasize on the client what are the efforts that they have taken, what are the initiatives they have taken, what kind of the behavioral changes that they have made, what kind of sacrifices that they compromises that they have made in terms of achieving this actually set goal. If the client is being complimented on the positive efforts which they have made and how those positive effort had really bring in this kind of an effective change, that really enforces the client's behavior, that really gives lot of confidence to the client in terms of handling the crisis. Once this reinforcement, positive reinforcement is given to the client, even in future when they encounter a similar kind of a problem, they will be having all the confidence in terms of handling that particular situation. They will not be always depending upon another person, it could be the counselor also, in terms of handling that particular problem or that particular situation. So that confidence will come only when the client is being reinforced on the behavioral change that they have brought in, or in terms of the effort that they have put in terms of bringing in the whole change. So that kind of a confidence the counselor should build in the client. So that only brings in the effective or sustained actually change in the client. Warn against the fight into health. This is another very important aspect that we have to keep in mind. So many a times actually the client sees a very dramatic recovery, even though the recovery is not because of any specific actually factors. Many non-specific factors are very superficial factors which could have brought in the result. And the client should understand that when they are getting these kind of dramatic recovery without putting in any effort, without bringing in any behavioral changes, without making any compromises, those kind of recovery or result is actually not long lasting. Actually, at any point of time the client can fall back or relapse actually into the same situation when they have been put into an unsupervised environment, okay, with the former stresses. So this kind of dramatic recovery without any specific effort, the client should not actually consider that is the way in terms of actually addressing the situation. Always the client should make a conscious effort in terms of making attempt in terms of actually bringing in the behavioral changes and specific efforts to come out from the problem. Giving instructions for maintenance of the adaptive functioning. So the client should counsel how to handle the potential problem situation. So when we talk about the problems, so we need to understand the primary prevention, the secondary prevention and the tertiary prevention. When we talk about the primary prevention is that you try to stop the crisis itself. You don't actually try to make the crisis to get developed. So that if you are not having any crisis, then we will not get into any problem at all. So the primary prevention is very, very crucial when we talk about actually the adaptive changes which needs to other when it comes to the client. The secondary prevention is that once the client has got the problem or get into any crisis, they should try to identify those problems at a very early stage and they should try to diffuse or destabilize those crises. If they could be able to do it at the early stage, then the effect actually will be very limited. And the last one is the tertiary prevention. So if they fail to do the secondary prevention, when it comes to the tertiary prevention, how we are going to avoid the maximum damage for the client, how we are going to minimize the damage for the client, and how we are going to take the necessary steps which is required for the correction process. These are the important aspects when it comes to the tertiary prevention. Discuss the follow-up session. This is another very, very crucial aspects when it comes to the counseling. So we should never conclude the therapeutic process abruptly. So it is always advised that actually we should have some kind of a follow-up session. Otherwise, the client might run into the problem very soon and they may not be able to actually know how to actually address this problem. So it can be contributed to the issue or issues of some reasons not actually solved during the therapy. So many a times this is what, if you are having a follow-up session, we could be able to see that some of the problems which has been left unaddressed, this is coming and this is creating a problem that can be addressed, so that actually the therapeutic process can be more sustained. If you are not having the follow-up session because of the small actually issues which has been left unaddressed, that will actually try to destabilize the functional equilibrium of the client. It is necessary for the client to continue to maintain contact with the counselor to maintain the functional equilibrium. So, it is always said that the client should have some kind of a contact with the counselor, especially after the termination of the counseling process during the initial period, till they become actually fully functional independently. And this follow-up session varies. Sometimes actually the follow-up session in certain cases will be scheduled every month, in certain cases quarterly, in certain cases it will be half-yearly. So, it all depends upon the nature of the problem and nature of the client and other aspects, which decides actually when and how often we are going to have this kind of follow-up sessions. And the last point is the stress open door. What is this stress open door refers to? The stress open door refers to continued uncritical accessibility of the counselor to the client. The client actually should not feel that once the counseling process get terminated, they cannot be able to approach the counselor again at all. Okay. And the client should not feel guilty whenever actually in case of any relapse happens. So, they should always feel that actually whenever relapse happens, relapse is a very common actually issue. In certain cases the relapse happens, and they can always actually go and approach the counselor whenever this kind of issues, and the counselor will be always available in terms of actually providing the required support. And this gives the client the confidence that all is not lost even if there is a relapse. So, this becomes very crucial, giving the confidence the client even during the time of relapse. They should not become fully dysfunctional. They should not feel that actually there is no other way out. They should always feel that actually the counselor is there, we can go and approach them, and he will try to provide the required support. If it is completed with satisfaction to both the client and the counselor, then the therapy is terminated formally. So, with this I just want to conclude the session by telling that the process involved in counseling is very crucial to bring in an effective and efficient change in the client's life, and we need to learn the process thoroughly, all the 4 phases: the initial interview, the assessment, the middle phase, and the termination process. If you learn the process thoroughly and if you could be able to follow the process thoroughly, then you could be able to practice the counseling in a much effective way. Thank you very much.